Brother Richard is a Capuchin Franciscan priest-friar living and working in Ireland. He teaches Christian meditation and has written some beautiful poetry too. Brother Richard, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
And I wondered, first of all, if you could give us a little bit of your background, how you came to be a priest-friar and why the Franciscans.
Okay. Well, to make a long story short, as they say, I've been a Capuchin friar for 28 years at this stage. The Capuchins are a branch of the Franciscan order founded by St. Francis of Assisi in 1209. Most people know St. Francis at least for his connection with nature and the natural world. And that was one of the things that attracted me as well. Before entering, I was very interested in the natural world, in biology. In fact, if I hadn't been a friar, I would probably have gone forward to study zoology. So a very different kind of life. But the combination of Francis as a man who could see in creation around us divine presence, and also particularly his joyful living of the gospel. These were qualities that attracted me. And when I came to visit with the friars, I found men, ordinary men, very ordinary indeed, but men who were attempting to live that same way of life in today's modern world. And so I decided I would knock on the door, and they very kindly let me in, and I've been here ever since.
I understood from a very lay perspective that St. Francis was actually quite influential in changing sensibilities and really bringing to the foreground a sense of wonder at creation, at nature, and a lot of the art that was inspired by Franciscan monasteries and so forth does put landscape and the natural world very much in the foreground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, indeed. There was a whole revolution going on at the time. Francis was right there at the high Middle Ages, just as we begin to tip into the pre-Renaissance era, and so civilization, Western civilization, was in a complete ferment at that time. They were about to face into the experience kind of like our own in terms of the plagues, etc. They were coming out of a mini ice age, believe it or not. We think of Francis wandering through beautiful sunlit Italian vistas, but the winters were extremely hard, particularly on poorer people. And you also had the rise of the middle class at the time. The feudal relationships of the early Middle Ages were giving way to a rich merchant middle class, from which Francis himself came. His father was a merchant. And so in the midst of all of this recalibration of society, Francis stood as someone who recalled people to the original simple message of the gospel, to a very caring idea of church, and also opened them up as well to the understanding, which had been with Christianity from the beginning, but which had been lost somewhat a little, of a God who is both immanent in his creation while at the same time transcending it.
And what about your role now? What does that entail? Because obviously this is a psychology podcast, so a lot of the people who will be listening are psychologists, either in practice or in training. But you too would be having dealings with people sometimes in periods of crisis and giving advice and counsel, I understand.
Sure. Well, the original understanding of psychology, if we go back to psyche itself, was the idea of I suppose now we tend to think of it as the brain, whereas before it was understood as the soul, or the eternal aspect of the person, that original being before it is influenced by the outside world and by the various influences around it. So in that sense, I suppose, as time has gone on, there has been a greater separation of psychology in its modern sense, and maybe the kind of psychology that the religious traditions, all of them, would look at. But in the same way, we provide a space in which people can tell their stories, a space in which they can be listened to deeply, a space in which they can receive counseling. Myself and many of the brothers are trained in various forms of pastoral counseling. We have quite a number of the brothers are fully qualified psychotherapists as well. We try and combine the best of what is modern with the deepest of the spiritual traditions. But in a very real way, our way of life hasn't changed that much. The principles are still the same. It's a life based on meditation, on working to provide a deep presencing, both of ourselves towards creation and towards our brothers and sisters as we encounter them. And at the essence of the Franciscan life is the understanding that every being that one meets is in some way a divine word, is in some way an expression of the divine made visible. And my job, as I encounter you or anybody else, is to be with your presence in an open, non-judgmental, presenced way, so as to allow our interaction to manifest the presence of the divine, which transcends your being, my being, every being. So in that sense, I suppose maybe there are both similarities and differences. But I think all of us would be on a path where we're trying to deal with people in a way that allows their original integrity to shine forth.
And you mentioned meditation as well. At the moment, particularly in probably in America, but also in the United Kingdom, Buddhist meditation and mindfulness meditation have become very popular. But Christian meditation has a long tradition of its own. How is it like and different from those other traditions?
Well, I've worked with our Buddhist brothers and sisters for many years, and I'm a mindfulness teacher as well. But with regard to Christian meditation, I suppose the obvious aspect is the very fact that it is Christian. So it is an encounter with the person of Christ. In the initial stages, all meditation from any tradition or none, essentially, is about slowing down, being with the present moment, using the breath as an anchor to bring ourselves into the present moment, allowing the body, the mind, the heart to relax, and preserving a non-judgmental inner vigilance that allows us to watch our processes in a way that allows us to then skillfully begin to correct or change them. So in that sense, it's the same as any other form of meditation. I suppose where we would go on a different path is that we would see all of that as happening within the context of the divine presence dwelling within. And we believe that all human beings carry within them the imprint of the divine presence at our very heart, the heart of the heart, as we put it. There is a place where God dwells. And in that sense, we can touch the transcendent within ourselves and also see a very deep inner healing activated through the grace of God, the action of God within us. In terms of the kind of mindful tradition that's out there as well, Christianity had its own forms of mindfulness. In ancient times, in Greek, these were known as prosophy, which was the art of attention, attending particularly to the present moment and recognizing that it is in the present moment that we encounter the divine presence. Indeed, going back into the Judeo-Christian tradition, the most ancient name of God and the deepest name of God is simply I am. And within the meditation on that amness, being itself, we would see an invitation to encounter within the present moment. So all of our forms of meditation are about anchoring within the present so as to come to an awareness of the presence, and then allowing our little presence to rest within that greater divine presence.
It's interesting as you're talking, there are so many intertwinings between different traditions and beliefs. And I know that as well as influencing many other traditions, Christianity or the Judeo-Christian tradition has also been influenced. And one of the other people I was talking to was a Stoic. And in my understanding of history, a lot of the tradition of Stoicism with altruism, moderation and self-control, that's also been taken in as part of Christianity, really.
Yeah, I think if we see all of these traditions as sort of separate experiences for humanity, then we do all of them a disservice. There's a great spiritual cross-fertilization that takes place through the ages, where people learn from each other, and indeed where people make journeys from traditions, from one tradition to another, or bring with them insights of different kinds. That great cultural foment that we call, the Middle East is a place of constant reinforcement of this. where all of the traditions spoke to each other, learned from each other. At peaceful times, which were sadly too few, managed to enter into deeply and extraordinarily productive dialogue. And at other times, at the very least, I think the mystics of the various traditions would recognize in each other a common thread and a common awareness.
And before we go into, you wrote recently a poem about the COVID-19 crisis, but just before that, I wanted to bring in a sense of, do you feel that that those of you who are coming from a particularly Christian tradition can also speak with people who regard themselves as agnostics, atheists, or of different religions, or so forth? Do you feel that there is that kind of crossover in conversation and in offering solace between traditions now?
Well, I think so, and I think the poem even shows that in
Yes.
the fact that it has gone so far to so many. But I suppose let's start from a common humanity. I think if we start from a common humanity, if I begin by naming you as other to me, then I immediately set up a wall between us and a place of judgment. Whereas if I see in you obviously a different individual, but the same as in at the very least the common human expression that is present, and also within my own tradition, I am expected to act towards you in reverence. So whether you are, you know, Jew, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, atheist, humanist, whatever it might be, the one thing I can certainly do is learn from you. And I think if I approach the other as an opportunity to learn, as an opportunity to be inspired, as an opportunity to be questioned and to clarify, then once I'm pursuing truth and once I'm pursuing compassion, then for the Christian in that moment, I am pursuing God and I am encountering God in the meeting with the other.
Beautiful. And talking of beauty, your poem definitely deeply touched me and everyone that I have passed it on to. So I was wondering if you would be kind enough to read it out for us, and then perhaps to explain how you came to write it and
Sure.
and what your feelings are about how your tradition can help to support people throughout this particular situation.
Sure. Okay. So, lockdown. Yes, there is fear. Yes, there is isolation. Yes, there is panic buying. Yes, there is sickness. Yes, there is even death. But they say that in Wuhan, after so many years of noise, you can hear the birds again. They say that after just a few weeks of quiet, the sky is no longer thick with fumes, but blue and grey and clear. They say that in the streets of Assisi, people are singing to each other across the empty squares, keeping their windows open so that those who are alone may hear the sounds of family around them. They say that a hotel in the west of Ireland is offering free meals and delivery to the housebound. Today, a young woman I know is busy spreading flyers with her number through the neighborhood so that the elders may have someone to call on. Today, churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples are preparing to welcome and shelter the homeless, the sick, the weary. All over the world, people are slowing down and reflecting. All over the world, people are looking at their neighbors in a new way. All over the world, people are waking up to a new reality, to how big we really are, to how little control we really have, to what really matters, to love. So we pray and we remember that yes, there is fear, but there does not have to be hate. Yes, there is isolation, but there does not have to be loneliness. Yes, there is panic buying, but there does not have to be meanness. Yes, there is sickness, but there does not have to be disease of the soul. Yes, there is even death, but there can always be a rebirth of love. Wake to the choices you make as to how to live now. Today, breathe. Listen. Behind the factory noises of your panic, the birds are singing again. The sky is clearing. Spring is coming. And we are always encompassed by love. Open the windows of your soul. And though you may not be able to touch across the empty square, sing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so you wrote that some days ago when in this country and in Ireland, we were still in the early stages when, you know, there was a position of uncertainty, but it seems to encapsulate a lot of the escalating emotions that are going forth as we progress through the crisis. What inspired you? What led you to want to write?
Well, there were two moments in that particular day. The first was hearing that young lady that I mentioned in the poem had found herself suddenly without a job, suddenly sent home from work, and her first instinct was to try and do something positive. Her first instinct was to reach out and create bonds of community. And I just thought how wonderful that was, how wonderful that inspiration moved in her heart straight away. And it just spoke to me of the raw goodness that's present in every human being. And sometimes the pressures of life, just the ordinary day-to-day pressures, get in the way of that. You know, it's not that we're ultimately hugely self-centered. It's that very often we're just very, very busy. And suddenly when the busyness goes away, we have a gap. We have an opportunity to do something new or to be maybe a better version of ourselves. And that's what she was choosing. And she's still doing it, by the way, and it has spread to many of her friends. The other element that inspired me and that really gave me the opening of the poem was reading a reflection by an anonymous, I don't know who it was, an anonymous Chinese lady who was writing about the experience of lockdown and how she had suddenly noticed she was hearing birds. And her grandmother was saying to her, I can remember when the birds used to sing here, but the factories had been so loud that they just hadn't noticed or hadn't been able to hear. And it was a particular moment of just recognizing the resilience of nature, the resilience of creation, that the moment we sort of get out of its way, it begins to renew itself. And it also begins to invite us into a deeper awareness. An awareness of the fact that we are not something separate from creation, but that we are part of a great conversation, a great song of praise, a great community that's going on around us, but that normally, again, our busyness and our noise prevents us from noticing. So they were the two inspirations really that led to the poem.
That brings forth some ideas in me. And one of them, I was reading on your blog, you had some suggestions about the busyness, and I think it's probably just as apt during a period of, I know I feel a certain amount of residual panic.
Sure.
You mentioned some ways to slow down. You talked about the 3 Ps, morning offering, and the bells. I don't know if that rings a bell from one of your blog posts.
Yeah. Well, I think first to start with the fact that, I mean, as you and your community know so well, I think to actually normalize anxiety as a response to this is very important. People can feel not just anxious about this, but anxious that they are anxious and sort of almost compound the difficulty. And for us to recognize that anxiety is a normal human response to a change in circumstances where we lose control. And once we sort of normalize it, then people can kind of take a breath with it and sort of say, you know, it's okay. And it's okay to have a conversation about anxiety. I think that's the first element. The second, I suppose, are some of those things you were talking about, which are just simply anchors that the tradition gives us to be able to come into maybe deeper connection with ourselves and deeper connection with the present moment. So simply things like, particularly with regard to our communication online, which is going to be of such benefit to us, but to do it in a skillful way and in a compassionate way is very important. And so When I teach meditation to young people, we always include now an online aspect of meditative awareness because people's lives are lived so much online. So the 3 Ps in that instance are to pause, to pray, in that to deliberately with intention touch meditation, to pause, to pray, and only then to post. And that allows a kind of a gap of reflection, so that we are making skillful choices about what we say and that we are speaking compassionately. Because one of the difficulties with a lot of our online work is that the nuances that maybe would be present within conversation are not present through a keyboard. And so people very quickly can be hurt, or can be isolated, or can be bullied, sometimes without the person even meaning to do it. So it's important that we sort of bring in gates, as we have gates to our speech, we would also have gates to mindful work online. The bells are simply the idea that, as in monasteries of all traditions, bells are rung to indicate different moments in the day. And the bell is a calling home, a calling to reorient ourselves once again to the compass point of the divine presence. Just as it is in the Buddhist tradition, it is in the Christian tradition as well. So to actually look at the things that I will ordinarily be doing, and to allow them to be bells that call me home to myself. So it might be simply things like having the cup of coffee in the morning, having the shower, doing my exercise, being present to the little bit of work that I'm doing, and allowing those moments to call me into presence. And that means approaching them a little more slowly, a little more deliberately, a little more with intention, and a little less distractedly. So just doing one thing and doing it fully. If I'm cleaning the room, just clean the room. If I'm listening to music, just listen to music. And to bring ourselves to those experiences as though I'm going to taste them deeply for the first time. And also to recognize that the most important bells of presence around us are the people we share our lives with. So the people who will call me to the deepest experience of compassion are always the people who live closest to me. It's very easy to love everybody out there. It can be very difficult to love people inside, particularly when I can't go anywhere else except inside. And I think people need to recognize that we're all going to need to be a little bit more patient, a little bit more compassionate, and also to offer a little more space to people. At the moment, people are concerned about those who will be alone through this experience. But I think very quickly we're going to be concerned about people who feel maybe claustrophobic or under pressure. People whose relationships have been bound to a great rhythm of going apart and coming back together, whether that's just leaving for work in the morning and coming back at home, or dropping kids off to school, or even just traveling for work and having space. So as these experiences become less present, it's going to be very important that we take space, and that we also allow people silence, that we allow people to go into the next room, to take their shower in peace, to take a sleep in peace, without necessarily always needing to be 100% present. So I think we certainly have a great challenge ahead of us in terms of skillfully navigating this with compassion and with presence.
It seemed to me, though, that in the poem, you are expressing a hope that this struggle might change some attitudes, some behaviours, some values, perhaps, which from any perspective are maybe not serving us so well now. And
Sure.
to me, it seems both a message of hope, but also a kind of call to action.
Yeah, and that is the hope behind the hope, I suppose, that as we look outside to look for the good news, we are addicted to negative news. There's no doubts about that in Western society today. And we repeat negative news over and over again. And with a rolling 24-hour news cycle, where if you actually analyze it, most of it is speculation. Most of it is people asking questions and wondering back and forth at each other, which leads again to a great sense of uncertainty and anxiety. So as well as obviously receiving our news from solid, good sources, I think one of the things that we can do is seek out for the good, look out for the good messages that are out there, pass them around and see them as invitations to be reflected upon, asking, well, where that young woman is concerned that's mentioned in the poem, could I do something similar? am I listening to the birds outside my window? Am I living in a way that is going to make the community around me, or even the people in my home, be able to go through this experience a little better than they would maybe if I was my usual self? And all of these things stretch us in new ways. But we have to recognize that we have a deliberate choice to make as to how we live this. And it's a deliberate choice that we make not just once, but in every succeeding moment, to recognize that there is the possibility of living this that allows me and you and everybody else to come out of it on the other side, hopefully, please God, well, but to come out of it on the other side stronger, more reflective, more aware of ourselves, and more aware of our responsibility to live with one another and with nature as well in a compassionate way.
I was going to mention that because when you were talking about Wuhan and the sound of the factories, which had prevented people from hearing the birds, or perhaps frightened birds away, and it reminded me of an article I read about the site of Chernobyl, where now there's a whole rewilding in that area,
yes.
with nature coming in and taking over. And it struck me that this particular situation, it's almost like an acute version of the chronic problem that is climate change. We as humans have played such a part in affecting the natural world, and we have to deal in some ways with the impact that we have on it. And maybe this could change some of the ways in which we as individuals, as nations, and as a global community function.
Absolutely. And I think it's an opportunity not to be lost. And that part of our conversation around this has to be around a greater ecological awareness for all of us. And it is wonderful to see how ecological systems almost immediately begin to try and repair themselves the moment humanity steps out for a moment, for a while. Just a few days after I'd written the poem, we got lovely news from our brothers in Venice to tell us that the canals are running clear for the first time in centuries, that the smell is disappearing, and that they were seeing swans on the canal. I mean, if a swan had landed on a Venetian canal a couple of years ago, I would hate to think what would have happened to the swan. But it is amazing how quickly nature restores itself. And that's also something that we can look at, because we're part of that. We're part of that system. And so the restorative power of nature, the healing power of nature, the healing power of a humanity that lives according to the cycles of nature, as opposed to our sort of imposing our will upon it constantly and demanding that it serves us, is something totally at odds with all of the spiritual traditions. It's worth recognizing that both Buddhism and Christianity speak of inner spiritual work as cultivation. The idea that we are gardening the soul, gardening the spirit, gardening the mind, and trying to work in harmony with all of those things. So I think one of the things that we could begin to look at is to recognize the challenge that's there for us, to live this moment as a moment of opportunity for ecological recalibration as well.
And I'm mindful of your time, but just one further thing. If you were working with your community, with individuals, or offering advice to perhaps people who are going to speak to members of the community, what kind of things would you be saying to offer particular solace or comfort to people at this moment?
I think firstly to take the long view, to recognize that this is something that humanity has gone through before and will probably go through again. When we look at the history of humanity, we see that every so often we do face the difficulty of a plague or a pestilence or whatever it might be, but we have always come through it. I think we live so immediately nowadays that we forget to look at ourselves as one great community rather than just individuals who are worried or stressed. So to take the long view, I think is very important, the wide view. Secondly, I'd say for people to begin to reframe the way they look at this crisis as opportunity rather than difficulty. And when we begin to look at opportunity, one of the first things that arises within us is a spirit of gratitude for what we do actually have. It is wonderful that we are going through this at a level of technological, I suppose, ability that allows us like this to have these conversations face to face, to maintain some form of community, even in the face of isolation. Thirdly, I think we need to be very truthful. People are going through real sickness, real pain, and as the poem itself mentions, there will be death. And as a society in the West, we tend to hide from death. St. Francis used to speak of death as sister death, because he said she is the one who is closest to us all of the time. And so when we practice an awareness of death, not in a morbid way or in a fearful way, but to simply recognize that it is part of our natural life, it's part of our cycle. And while we are called to do everything we can, obviously, to live healthily and to get over these illnesses and to listen to all of the advice of our health practitioners around it, at the same time to recognize that there is a moment for all of us where we will shuffle off this mortal coil, as they say, and to begin to face that awareness with compassion and with self-compassion. And I really would call on everybody out there, whoever will listen to this, whoever will hear this, to recognize that there is a moment of self-compassion called for, to be aware that this challenge is something that we have to face, but that we can face it in a generous and compassionate way.
And how is your life, your community, as the Franciscan Brotherhood in Ireland, being affected now?
Yeah, it is affected. So public celebration of Mass has finished for the foreseeable future. The monastery where I live, our chapel is quite small. It only holds about 80 people. So obviously social distancing within that environment would be quite difficult. And so our daily celebration of the services now takes place in private with the brothers, though the chapel itself is still open for individuals to drop in, to have a space, a moment of prayer. And our grounds are open as well, so people can walk the grounds and have a little bit of quiet and calm outside. We have a little pilgrim path that finishes with a labyrinth, a walking meditation, so people are able to use that space. Some of the brothers in the community here are chaplains to hospitals and to hospices for the dying. So they're going through a whole new training in terms of how they will deal with patients who may have the virus, and the various barriers that will need to be put in place. So that can be awkward and difficult, but at the same time very necessary. And in terms of our own ministry, in terms of our contact with family and friends, all of that has been limited now at this stage. And we're trying as best we can to observe social distancing between ourselves as well. The community that I live in is quite elderly. I'm the youngest here. And we jump very quickly into late 70s up into the 90s. And so one of the great gifts of that for me is to see men who are living this with tremendous serenity, with very deep presence, and with an openness to helping until they are not able to help anymore. And so they have put themselves at the service of the various health centers that they work with, so that they can be there for people, and that they're quite open to facing Sister Death whenever she tips them on the shoulder.
Brother Richard, it's been very much of a privilege to speak to you, and I don't like particularly to end on the subject of Sister Death, but I think that you've wrapped up the conversation, and I wanted to thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for being on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. It's been a gift. Thank you.